I have the pleasure this evening of introducing Annie Grandell, who's the director of YDisciple. YDisciple is a youth evangelization resource that is started as part of the Augustine Institute and is now owned by Net Ministries. Annie was a Net missionary. She worked as a coordinator of youth ministry in a parish. She has a number of children, and she's actually um, coming to us tonight from what was her office in the parish where she used to work as the coordinator of youth ministry, though she's been running YDisciple for, I think, 8 years now. And
Gosh, really? Wow.
yeah, with that, I will pass it over to Annie.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Patrick, and everyone for being here on a rainy night. I was telling the team before we jumped on that I'm a little jealous of your rainy night because I'm coming to you from Minnesota, and it is currently 3 degrees. It's awful. I love Minnesota for everything else, but this is not my favorite. But it's so happy to be with you. As Patrick said, I work for Net Ministries and I'm the director of YDisciple. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Net, Net's been around for 43 years and has been training young adult missionaries to do evangelistic work to Catholic young people. So going around putting on very simple retreats for Catholic teenagers to encounter the basic gospel message and be able to respond in prayer and to start a personal relationship with the Lord. Net has trained over 4,000 missionaries here, but we also have branches in Canada, Australia, Uganda, Scotland, Ireland. And so it's just a really wonderful organization that I get to work for, where the gospel is so central to everything that we do. I served as a net missionary a number of years ago, we'll say. It's been a minute, but was just an incredible formative experience for my life. Learning how to share the gospel, it's what sparked in me a love of youth ministry beyond my own experience in youth ministry in high school. It's also where I met my husband. And we now have 4 children. Those 4 children are how they're 11, 9, 7, and 5. And so just the great joy of my life. What I get to do for Net is I'm the director of YDisciple. So YDisciple is a digital toolbox to help adults do small group discipleship with teenagers. So we always say the secret to YDisciple is people think it's this thing um, for teenagers, and it is that is our final audience. But the toolbox really exists for adults. It exists for ministry leaders who work for the parish or school, and for the volunteers who are running those small groups. And I know you've had a ton of conversations with Everett Fritz, a couple presentations from him. I watched his presentation today to make sure we weren't saying the same thing because he and I tend to say the same thing. We work out of the same playbook. So YDisciple, what we get to do is I get to take Net's 43 years of experience in training missionaries, and I get to package it in a way so that the average person in the pews who has no theological training, a little ministry experience, how do we break into your world and help you become a disciple maker? So we do that by creating training content for adults, which I think is our most important thing, and also content for teenagers for you to do in the small group with teenagers. Some of it's video, some of it's not. We all know teenagers do not need videos week after week, year after year. So while YDisciple is generally known as a video resource, we're actually much more than that. And I always tell people, like, do not show them videos all of the time. So that's just a little background about who I am and where I'm coming from. At the end, if anyone has questions about like what YDisciple is, what that looks like, I'm happy to show you around. But that's a bit of my background. Some of you in this webinar may be old enough to remember an ad that I remember from the 80s called the Hair Club for Men. There was this ad, it was about hair restoration. And it was a long ad because ads were longer in the 80s. And at the very end, the spokesman said, I'm not only the president, I'm also a client. And it showed his like before and after picture. And everyone's like, Gosh, I feel like I'm that guy for small group discipleship. I don't just do this because it's my job. I don't just talk about small groups and how awesome they are and youth ministry because I'm supposed to. I do it because I was a youth minister myself for 12 years. And I saw small groups fundamentally change everything about my ministry. And I saw fruit that I never would have expected to see. I believe in small group discipleship with every fiber of my being. And I know Everett's talked about it, but that term is very intentional, right? Small group discipleship. Because can you have discipleship without small groups? Absolutely. I know many places who've instituted like one-on-one discipleship. Fantastic. That's amazing. Um, can you have small groups without discipleship? That's the confirmation program I ran for like 10 years. So I can guarantee you, you can absolutely have small groups without discipleship. I had 150 students come through my confirmation program every year. I put them in small groups and said, well, everyone said this is how you're supposed to do it. So this is what's going to happen. Put them through the conveyor belt and think they'd come out disciples at the end of the year. And guess what? At the end of every year, they all left because there was a lack of intentionality in what we were doing. I was pushing them through content, and we weren't stopping to know them and their needs and their questions and their concerns and their issues. I wasn't concerned about having small group leaders who were mentoring them in the Christian life, which is really the heart of discipleship. Um, I was concerned with getting enough warm bodies to pull off that large confirmation program. And I know that's a pain point for so many people. I can talk later about what small groups look like in my scenario, but I know that's not our biggest thing. That intentionality overlaps with what we're talking about here, relational ministry. We're talking about the heart of relational ministry tonight, and we'll define that term here. But I actually want to start praying with a gospel. One of my favorites from Luke chapter 19. And I have this giant Bible with me. Yes, thank you. Because I took all my children to faith formation tonight. They go to Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, and it's actually at the parish where I used to be a youth minister. And I asked them, I said, hey, do you have a place that I could run this webinar while I'm there? Because the times overlapped just really kind of perfectly. And they said, yep, there'll be a room up there. Go. I haven't worked here for about 8 years. And the room they sent me to was my literal old office. I was like, well, why not? Go back to the scene of the crime. But they had this nice giant Bible here for me because it's a CGS, Adrian. So we start with Luke 19. And it says, Jesus came to Jericho and intended to pass through town. Now a man there named Zacchaeus, who was a chief tax collector and also a wealthy man, was seeking to see who Jesus was. But he could not see him because of the crowd, for he was short in stature. I love that. I'm 5 feet tall. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree. He climbed a sycamore tree in order to see Jesus, who was about to pass that way. When he reached the place, Jesus looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down quickly, for today I must stay at your house. And he came down quickly and received him with joy. When they all saw this, they began to grumble, saying, he has gone to stay in the house of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, behold, half my possessions, Lord, I shall give to the poor. And if I have extorted anything from anyone, I shall repay it 4 times over. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a descendant of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save what was lost. We could spend hours unpacking this one gospel passage. Again, it's a short girl's favorite. My husband always talks about, like, there was once he was doing Lectio Divina every day, and he spent a year stuck on this one because the Lord just kept showing him more and more, and he just kept chewing on it for a year every day. There's so much we could unpack. There's a couple of things that I think are really critical. The first is this. It starts by saying Jesus went to Jericho and intended to pass through town. It was not part of his plan to stop. But he encounters somebody who is seeking him, and he turns around and he changes his plan to be with this person. So it goes from he's intending to pass through town with, and in a couple of sentences, he's like, I'm staying at your house today. Like in a matter of moments. When it comes to our ministry, when it comes to the catechesis that we are about, the temptation is always to just keep moving, right? But when we talk about real people, real teenagers, frequently we need to stop our plan, not throw it out the door. Plans are important, but we need to stop and see the person right in front of us. And the other thing is really key. He stops and he sees Zacchaeus up in the tree and he says, Zacchaeus, come down quickly. There's only a handful of times Jesus uses anybody's name directly, usually talks in generalities. And the majority of the time he's talking to Peter. There's only a handful of times that he names somebody. So this is really key. But again, in a matter of sentences, Zacchaeus is like, I quit my job. I'm giving away everything. Jesus did no miracle here. There is no show. The miracle was he knew his name. And that recognition, that moment of being not just noticed, but known, literally changed everything for Zacchaeus. It changed everything. When it comes to ministering to young people, I am a firm believer that any kind of ministry we do, and there are many kinds of ministry that we can do. Catechesis, for example, I'll use that as an example because my children are going through it all right now. Profound, important. Our faith is full of beautiful, beautiful truths that I want them to know. But it does not make sense outside of the context of a relationship. And I know that is a strong and very absolute statement, but I believe it. I believe it because the end of catechesis is not knowledge. The end of catechesis is for them to know a person. The end of catechesis is that they would not just know a person, but they would give their lives to a person, that they would have a lived personal relationship with the person of Jesus Christ. And if that is the end, if that is the goal of our ministry, then isn't it the best possible means? Give yourself a minute. Pause for a minute and frame it in your own experience. How are you here? How are you here to the point that you work at a parish or school, that you are volunteering, that you showed up to a webinar on a Wednesday night with some lady with a probably impressive Minnesota accent? I've resisted it for many years, but I think I've just given up now. You're here because it matters to you. Think about your own experience. How did you get here? And I would venture to guess that every single person watching this webinar right now can name a minimum of one person. Yes, there's things that we learned about the faith that were mind-blowing. I remember in my teenage years, learning some of the scriptural roots of the Eucharist and being like, oh my gosh, this is real. There was an intellectual ascent I made. But I didn't end up there because of a book alone. I ended up there because of many, many people in my life who I had strong relationships with, my parents, My youth minister was incredibly important to me. My older sister, who had gone through a conversion experience, and I saw something profoundly different about her, and I wanted it. There was something attractive about it. None of us are here without a story of at least one person. But I bet if we give ourselves even more time, we can name many. If you want to give yourself an excuse to be grateful and humbled, spend some time in prayer, writing down the name of every individual who had an impact on your faith life. And many of us, when we see that list, it's overwhelming. The riches that we have in love and relationship. Um, and that's not just a nice thought, right? Those aren't just nice things to say. There's a lot of data around it. I'm going to try to minimize how many stats I throw at you today. I'm really going to try. There was once my son, he was 4. And he said to me, kind of out of nowhere, I work from home a couple days a week, so they hear me working frequently. Um, and he said to me, Mom, whose data? I was like, what? He said, who is data? I always hear you say you love data. And I was like, ah, okay. So it's numbers and stuff. Like I'm trying to explain statistics to a 4-year-old. Like it's numbers and stuff. It's like it's a work thing for mom. And he looks at me deadpan and he goes, Mom, you told us we are supposed to love people and not things. I was like, oh, isn't it the worst when they parrot you back to you? I was like, no. But anyway, um, so these aren't just nice thoughts. Like relationship is the context for all of it. There's tons of data supporting it. One of the most interesting, I think, comes from Fuller Youth Institute out in California. And they did a long-term study following young people who maintained the faith practice of their upbringing after leaving the home. The study is called Sticky Faith. It's very interesting. And they found something that is a statistical anomaly that of all 100%, which is you never see 100% in stats. 100% of the young people who maintained the practice of their faith after leaving home could name a minimum of 5 adults who had been invested in their faith and in their faith development. 5 to 1. So often when we're talking safe environment, we're talking 7 to 1, 8 to 1, depending on the event that you have, right? It's important. It's good. I'm all for it. But we often tend to think about lots of students and a few adults. But our young people need adults. Their parents are critical. Every study shows that. Their parents are critical for their faith development. But their parents are only 2 people, max. In many families, it's one parent that's driving that. Parents need more adults in their kids' lives. 5 to 1, I find that fascinating. Another study that I would recommend checking out comes from the Springtide Research Institute. They have a study called Belonging, and they name a couple things. First, that Gen Z, so that's our high schoolers. We're in the middle of a generational transition. I'm not going to get too much into it. Katie Gray's going to get into it next month. She's fabulous. It'll be great. But that Gen Z is the loneliest generation currently, which is new. Every other time they've done studies on loneliness, the demographic that had always come up before was the elderly. But there was this switch. And Gen Z is identified as the loneliest generation. And what Springtide talks about is that belonging has tiers to it. Being a part of a thing doesn't necessarily mean you belong anymore. Attendance doesn't equal belonging. And they name three different levels in what they've termed belongingness. And that is the only time I'm going to say that because that is a tongue twister. It's that word. But I recommend looking it up. But the three tiers are that you are noticed, that you are named, and that you are known. Noticed, named, and known. Many young people report feeling invisible in their church communities, particular. That they're convinced that if they stopped going, nobody would notice. Noticing, naming, and knowing. And isn't that what Jesus does to Zacchaeus? He notices him in the tree. He calls him by name, and then he goes and eats dinner with him. And he actually gets into his life. The truth is, we can have the best facts and the truest statements about the faith. I would argue we do have the best facts and truest statements being Catholic. But 9 times out of 10, the truth we have to share is going to fall on deaf ears unless we have earned the relationship and the place to say those things. Knowing a person, sharing the faith in the light of that relationship. So when I'm talking about relational ministry, I am not talking just about youth group. I'm not just talking about the youth minister who's in the office, ironically, as I am right now. I'm talking about anyone who is engaged with young people in the faith. Anybody. Relational ministry can happen in the context of CCD. Relational ministry can happen in the context of outside of the church walls. Relational ministry can happen with people who aren't textbook examples of what we would think, like, oh, young people are going to love them. Young people love authenticity. That's what they love. And they want to be known. St. John Bosco, the great educator and patron saint of youth, was known to have said, without confidence and love, there can be no true education. This is not a new concept. It's how Jesus did ministry. It is the incarnation. It's what we are celebrating in this season of Advent. It's preparing for God to become man, become one of us, walked with people, lived with people. He didn't just preach. So frequently we imagine the Gospels as this Sermon on the Mount, every word out of his mouth. But the truth of the matter is those moments are actually quite few. When we dig through the red letters, he's frequently talking to the 12, often the 3, occasionally the 1. Jesus is preaching. The words we have of his were frequently said to smaller groups. Hashtag small groups. No, I'm not just trying to push my agenda here, but it's how Jesus did things. We want to build relationships with young people so they can know the Lord, so they can experience being known by him. For so many of them, he feels so distant. But you're right there, and you can show them what the life of a Christian looks like. The word Christian, when they first started calling people that, it meant little Christ. You can be that Christ to them. So what does that look like? A few things. I'm going to give 4 movements, 4 categories for us to kind of frame this all in. If you have questions, throw them in the chat. When we're done here, I would love to have a conversation. I am a big proponent of dialogue and not just monologue. And I'm in the middle of giving you a monologue. And so I am aware of that. But for the sake of this context here, I want to make sure we have space for you guys to answer any questions that you have about what relational ministry can look like in the real world. So what does it look like? The first thing is be interested. Be interested in the teenagers in your spheres of influence as people, not just small group members, not just students, as people. As you would with any adult, take time to get to know their interests, their background, their hobbies, beyond their attendance in whatever ministry you are a part of. Um, Sometimes we have in the events that we do, like get to know you activities, icebreakers. They can feel like a waste of time, uh, but they provide an opportunity to get to know people. Some young people hate games. They hate those icebreakers. I'm an introvert. Anytime somebody tells me I have to do an icebreaker, I'm like, oh, cool, you're off purgatory. That's great. Um, check. Um, some people love it, some people don't. But taking time before you do, so let's say you're in the context of a CCD class, before you do any lesson that you've been asked to do, to just ask about them and pay attention. I take notes. My life is busy. I move from one thing to the next. I don't do it like in front of them. I'm like, you like football. But at the end of a class or end of a small group, I have a notebook and I'll just make a note of things. And then I'll ask them about it last week. Did you see the Vikings game? See, I'm telling you where I'm from. Um, uh, Tell me about something that's interesting to you. When we pay attention to those things and then circle back on them, it is unbelievable what that does for them. Like somebody like actually listened to what I said, and cared about it enough to ask me another question. A simple way we can do this is when we're in a formal setting, like a small group or like a class. Every time we start with a simple question. What was the high and low of your week? Show that you want to know about their life between Wednesdays. What was the high and low of your week? Side note, you're going to want to put time boundaries on that because once they start to get really comfortable with each other, that will take over your group. Not a bad thing. It's good for them to share life. And once you get teenagers talking about anything, you're like, we can talk about anything, but be interested in what's going on. Even moments of individual small talk with them. Um, I would argue that if you're just getting started in the world of relational ministry, that the first few times you're together is going to be largely just getting to know them and letting them get to know each other. Everett talked about last month asking the question, have you won the relationship? Have you won the relationship in your ministry, whatever that looks like? Have you earned the right to be heard? It will bear fruit. Um, Also, if you're interested in them, you'll know their names. Um, Knowing names is incredibly important. Again, going back to Zacchaeus, it's every person's favorite word when somebody remembers who they are. Um, Learn them. If learning names is hard for you, cool. It just means you're going to have to work harder. It's not an excuse. There was a time in my own ministry where I would have small groups together for an entire confirmation year. They would leave. I would ask a small group member or leader about, hey, how is Bobby at the end of the year? And they're like, I don't know who that is. The leaders had gone through the whole year and they had not learned the names of the students in their small group. Know their names. Incredibly, incredibly important. Um, Another way we can do that is by asking questions, right? Um, I believe in ministry, in my other relationships with my children, never make a statement when a question will do. Some of my favorite like funny things my kids have said is like, I always want to like come in over top of them and correct them. I'm like, tell me why you think that. Um, and they'll say something off the wall and I love it. And I'm always really glad that I asked a question. But never make a statement when a question will do. They say something about their life. Interesting. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Follow up, dig a little bit deeper. It takes a little while. Many of them aren't used to somebody showing interest in them in that way. So you're playing a long game, um, but be interested in the young people in your group. The second thing is be a witness. You, as the adult in this situation, have a powerful opportunity to share your own story of faith. Discipleship, again, I know you've had other talks on this. I'm not going to get too much into it, but discipleship is about following somebody and imitating the way that they live. They need to know that you're not just showing up and checking a box, that this is incredibly important to you. Share your story of how you have come to know the Lord. Often this is called a testimony, to relate theological concepts to life. This also demonstrates to them that you're not just an instructor with a bunch of material to download into them, but you're a real person who's had real struggles, and somebody who has really encountered God. God is not just a theory. Beyond the big conversion moments of your life, it's always good to have a lot of little God stories, right? Different ways God has touched your life, ready to share at any moment. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got in ministry was somebody said, when somebody asks you a hard question about the faith, about God, he said the first words out of his mouth are, I know in my own life, because he may not have an answer yet, but at least gets things moving. And it's not just like, well, let me point to in the catechism where it tells you the answer. It's like, I know in my own life, I've seen it play out this way. Then we can bring in the catechism, then we can bring in this beautiful, rich theology. But starting with the witness of our own life, ready to share. We actually have a worksheet that I can send to Patrick to share with you all on writing your own story. Um, we train, so at the beginning, I was talking about the young adult missionaries we train at NET. And one of the first things we teach them to do is not how to give a talk in front of a bunch of teenagers, but how to share and write their own testimony. And they have to do it in 3 minutes, which is harder to do than 20, right? Somebody famously said, if I'm going to talk for an hour, give me 10 minutes to prepare. If I'm going to talk for 10 minutes, give me 2 weeks to prepare. It's harder to say things shorter. So I can share with you this worksheet of like writing out your own stories. What happened before? What was my life like before God acted? How did God act? And how is my life different after God acted? The key is keep the focus on Him, that He's the hero of the story, not me, and not our sin. Too often we tell these stories and we glorify the sin, right? But that God is the hero of the story going all the way through. Sharing your own experience will also help the students in your group or your class share with depth themselves, right? If we're concerned that they always stay on the surface, maybe it's because we always stay on the surface. So you give them permission to be vulnerable. You can set the tone. Sharing your testimony is so important. That again, we could do a whole other thing on it. But I will share that document with Patrick to share with you all. So first, be interested. Second, be a witness. Third, be present. Be present to the young people in your small group when you're with them. That's simple things like putting your phone away. That's simple things like eye contact, asking follow-up questions, but also being present, if feasible, outside of church time, showing up in their lives in a not creepy way. That's really important. But if they're talking about like, hey, I've got a big play this weekend, I'm really excited about it. Like, can I come? Great. Um, Show up to that. Send them a note. Anytime you do that, one of the things I do recommend to keep everything above board is send a note to their parents. Like, hey, I really enjoyed getting to know Lucy in our group. She mentioned there's a play. I'm planning on coming. I just really want to support her. You've got a great kid and a lot to be proud of. Love Annie. Maybe not love Annie, but but keeping that communication open with parents because parents would rightly be like, why is this adult just showing up at things? Let them know why you're doing it. If you're a catechist or a volunteer, letting know your parish ministry leader that this is something that you're planning on doing. Parish ministry leaders, can you show up to some of their things? Go to a football game on a Friday night, even if like nobody's going to be on the field that you know, like you're going to run into your people. There's something really powerful about showing up to their stuff and showing up to their turf. We frequently, almost exclusively, ask young people, ask people in church world to show up to our turf, to the church's turf. Come to this event we're putting on, come to this class we're putting on, come to our school, come to all of those good things. None of them are bad. I am not knocking them. But infrequently do we show up to their turf um, where they're more comfortable. Um, I know Everett talked about small groups meeting at school before and after school. Like they're more comfortable there because it's where they spend more of their time. I'll tell a story of a small group that was running when I was a youth minister. There was so when we started doing small groups in our ministry, really putting an emphasis on small discipleship groups. We made the decision to have them meet at different times and different places. The first reason was teenagers are busy, families are busy. And so when my ministry was only on one day and one time, I was only available to kids who were available on that day and at that time. So we had some small groups that met before school. We had some that met after. We had some that met Wednesday nights. Most of them met on Sunday nights, which was a little funny because I was all the kids who wouldn't show up to youth group, it was on Sunday nights. They were like, I can't. That's when I do homework. We have family stuff. When I gave them the choice of when do you want your small group to meet, they all chose Sunday nights, all of them, except for like two groups. It was very funny. I was like, okay, clearly I was doing something that wasn't meeting their needs. That's fine. Not about me. But so we had groups meeting at different places as well. I would recommend that you do check in with Rosemary and Patrick, check in on safe environment standards, make sure you're checking all the boxes because that's incredibly important. I never want to downplay that. We had permission from our archdiocese for them to meet off campus. And there was a group that met at the local coffee shop here in town. And they were it was a group of girls. There was this one young woman who went to the public high school who was just on fire for her faith. And she had a really strong relationship with one of her former teachers from the Catholic school, who she really wanted to mentor her. And they said, okay, how about Cece, you ask any friends that you could think of that you might be interested in being a part of this group. And because this girl just like loved the Lord, it was coming up in conversations all the time. And like, she had a couple friends that were like, oh gosh, we used to go to church, but I don't anymore. Kind of wish we did. There's something that like, I want something more. I don't really know what that is. So she invited these girls. So it was really a diverse group from experience of faith life in the home. But they all had this common affinity. They were all a group of friends from school. And they invited Molly in to come and be their mentor. And they met at the coffee shop. Two things about this small group. One, I was the youth minister who'd been running the show as a bit of a Pied Piper for a very long time, drawing everyone into my thing. And it was on the outside successful, but not when you really looked at, again, the numbers, where we really hitting the right number of teenagers in the parish. Plus, it was taking over my life. Like if more people needed more things, I needed to clear more of my evenings and more of my weekends. And at that point, I had a young family. I had limited time I could do that with. Launching small groups really multiplied me and my capacity. And there was one Sunday night when we normally would have been having youth group, but it was a small group night. I got to go to a family event on a Sunday night, which never had happened for about a decade. And my husband and I were driving home, and we drove past this coffee shop where Molly's small group was meeting. And as we drove by, I could see them in the front window. And my poor husband, because I think I did this, I went, "Ah!" And he's like, what is happening? Almost drove off the road. And I was like, Jason, youth ministry is happening in this town and I'm not there. And it was so beautiful and so freeing because I didn't have to be the center. I didn't have to be holding it all together, in control of it all. They were in capable hands. It was a beautiful moment of freedom for me and a reorientation to like, who should be the center, Annie? The other thing about that group, though, as Molly got to know these girls, eventually she was like, "Hey, what mass do you guys go to? I go to 11. If you're looking for people to go to mass with, come sit with me." She's like, "I'm single. Come. I don't want to be sitting at mass alone. Come sit with me." And two girls were like, "Oh yeah, we have not been to church since we made our first communion." Molly, not making a statement when a question would do, said, "Why is that? Tell me more about that." And just got curious, not like, "Why is that? Let me show you in the catechism where it's a mortal sin." True. You don't lead with that, though. She asked a question. She got curious. Turns out what happened is there had been a scandal in our parish, and those two families didn't feel comfortable being here anymore. I'm convinced those kids never would have darkened the door of our youth room because it wouldn't have been a place that their parents felt safe sending them. But the local coffee shop was. Um, and because they were friends with Cece, it was safe. It was on their turf. So again, please be mindful of your local safe environment policies. But it's incredibly important to figure out ways that we can show up for young people on their own turf whenever. So first thing, be interested. The second, be a witness. The third, be present. And fourth, be yourself. They need you, authentically you, in their lives. Think about that 5-to-1 ratio again. There's this really sticky myth about teenagers that is just fundamentally untrue, that you have to be young to be interesting and appealing to young people. That's not necessarily true. I got hired as a youth minister when I was 22 years old, wearing Birkenstocks and having a nose ring. I still have my nose ring, and playing guitar because they thought I was young and hip and was going to get all the kids to follow me. Also, you don't want all the kids following a 22-year-old. That's a terrible idea. But that's not what they needed. They needed an authentic person who loved the Lord and who loved them. So be yourself. If you don't know the lingo they're using, oh gosh, my fifth grader said something today, and I was like, I literally have no idea what that means. She laughed and she told me, but I just owned it. I was like, I have no idea what that means. And I'm not young and I'm not hip, but it is my literal job to know what's going on in youth culture. And I had no idea what she was talking about. So she laughed and she told me, if you don't know what they're talking about, tell them. Like they'll get a kick out of like getting you up to speed. They'll love to do it. And if you're comfortable and at ease, they will be. They know when you're not being you. Teenagers, I've worked with teenagers my entire adult life, and still to this day, my favorite thing about them is they can smell a fake from a mile away. And so it keeps you very honest. They know. Be comfortable with how it's going. Be comfortable with your small group. Fight against comparison, like, oh, that catechist is cooler than I am. how other leaders might relate to young people. The Lord creates us differently. We are unique and unrepeatable. He wants your personal personality to relate to the young people he's put in your context. Relating is going to be different for everyone, though. For some, it's going to come easy. For some, it's going to be second nature. Others are going to be, it's going to be a bit more work. Others aren't going to stand it, aren't going to be able to stand it. But what I would encourage you to do is, if this is what the Lord is calling you to do, if he is inviting you to be a part of ministering to this younger generation, ask for the grace to show up and to be yourself, to be interested. Ask for the grace to serve them well, because they need adults in their life who care. We can draw inspiration from the words of St. Paul, and I'll end with this so that we can open it up for a few questions here. St. Paul says, "We are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our very selves as well." We are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our very selves as well. So as you enter into doing relational ministry with young people, keep that in mind, that is what the Lord is calling us to do. So I just want to open it up for any questions. I know Patrick has been filling up the chat here, which is fantastic. He makes my job so easy, because normally afterward, I'm like, here's all the links. You already did it. It's great.
You're welcome to unmute to ask a question, raise your
Please.
hand if you want us to recognize you, or put it in the chat.
Annie, would you talk about praying with kids?
Yes.
How to bring that authenticity, that sensitivity to where they're at and so on, into walking with them into the presence of Jesus, speaking to him, hearing from
Yeah.
him.
Yep. I love that. So two things. If you're in a formal context, like a small group or a classroom, always start and end with prayer. Always. We want to be connecting the content that we're talking about, the conversations that we have, to that relationship with the Lord. I'd recommend getting more comfortable freestyle praying, which for us Catholics, we may not have as much muscle memory for, but the more we do it, the less awkward it gets. But just praying out loud, like, Jesus, come into this conversation that we're having, ending with a rote prayer that everybody feels comfortable with so we can land the plane in like comfort zone. But opening things up to prayer. I recommend ending with a time of intercession, and saying, okay, what do you guys want? What do you guys want to pray for this week? Couple things that I tend to do with that. What happens when we're learning to pray aloud, especially for young people? Dr. Amanda Drury from InterVarsity talks about how faith is like a language that we are well versed in, but it's nobody's first language, right? You learn languages by immersion and by practice, not just by textbook. So as they're learning to talk about their faith, it's going to be clunky and awkward in the beginning because it's something they may not have a lot of experience with. Similar with prayer. If they don't have experience praying out loud, it can be awkward. And not just awkward, it can feel forced. So what I recommend doing is saying, okay, we're going to end praying for each other. What is something everybody wants prayers for? And let them share before prayer starts. My grandma's not doing well. I've got a big test that I'm nervous about. And then say, okay, now let's pray. You can either have them pray for their own intention, or you can say, okay, who wants to pray for that one? And like have them pick who they want to pray for. But the reason I say have them voice it beforehand, what happens when they're learning the language of faith and learning how to pray aloud, they will frequently, and adults do this too, it turns into just sharing things with our eyes closed. Like, all right, we're going to pray. So my grandma's really sick. And it's like, oh, okay, that'd be good to know. but giving them a chance to actually pray. And another thing that is really helpful in that is asking them to address God. Again, God is a person. This whole relational stuff comes back to the fact that God is a person. So tell them to pick their favorite title for him: Jesus, Lord, Spirit, Father, whatever they want to call him. And instead of just saying, I want to pray for my grandma, that's a statement. Say, Jesus, I lift up to you my grandma. And so it's just teaching them those little tiny steps to make it something that is more natural for them. So absolutely. So in informal context, start and end with prayer. Give them a chance to voice their prayer before they pray their prayer. But then in informal context, got a young person having a conversation with you. They stay after and they're like, I'm really stressed about my grades. I'm freaking out. I'm really anxious. I'm not sleeping. Great. Not great. What we tend to say is, that sounds really hard. I'll pray for you. That is good. I forget all the things so fast. It is really powerful for them to say, hear you say, that sounds really hard. Can I pray for you right now? And pray with them for like 30 seconds. It's so simple, but it is so profound what that can do. They will experience something so real. They will experience something real if you pray for them later. But what you're doing is, again, it's that discipleship. It's that showing the living of the Christian life. You can show them prayer instead of just tell them about prayer. So, Bob, I think that's such a phenomenal question.
No answer. Thank you.
Thank you. I had when I first started in ministry, I was in the parish putting up a bulletin board for some event. And at our parish, we always have retired priests who come and retire out here because it's like a pretty little community. And this one priest, Father Robert Vallet, comes walking by with his cane and he saw me doing something. He's like, "How are the young people?" And I reached for recent numbers. Like, we just had this many people go on the mission trip, and I was like rambling, and he does this thing that only an old priest can pull off. Like, if I did that, I'm a jerk, but he does it, and you're like, "Thank you, Father." He's like, "Are you teaching them to pray? Because if you're not teaching them to pray, you're wasting your time." And walked away. Like, but I have held that in my heart for 2 decades. Other questions?
How did you, because you talked about how when you started, you had small groups without discipleship, without relational ministry.
Yep.
When and how did that transition from not having that to working towards having that happen? What made you try to change, and how did you go about it?
You're going to laugh at me. It was numbers. Um, but no, very truly. So I'd been in ministry for about 8 or 9 years at that point. And we had what was on the outside, something that looked really good. I'd been hired to be the Pied Piper who built the big youth group. And we were reaching about 100 students a year. I had a very full youth room. For those of you who work in a parish, I had the trifecta. My pastor didn't ask me questions, my DRE didn't ask me questions, and the business administrator didn't ask me questions. Like, what more do you need? It looked good, and it was good. We had amazing young people. I had a great core team. And there was one night very specifically, I can remember being at my youth group and looking at this group and being simultaneously grateful and in awe and thinking, I hope nobody's done the math, because I had. And while it looked good, I knew we were reaching less than 20% of the students in our parish. And if we are evangelists, if we are missionaries, we have to be a hell of a lot hungrier than 20%. And so I was unsatisfied with that. And around the same time, I went on maternity leave, which was the first break I'd taken from work, ever. And really just spent a lot of time in prayer with it. A lot of soul searching, a lot of Google searching. Like, something feels off. Like, we're not meeting our kids' needs, is what I just kept coming back to. Like, we're meeting this group of kids' needs, but like 80% of them we're not. And I knew we had kids in the parish that were really into their faith. Youth group wasn't their thing. And so found YDisciple through my soul searching and Google searching. I had been to a YDisciple training when it was first launched in 2011. I still have the notes. They're on my desktop still. I've transferred it to like 4 different laptops from that first event. And I remember sitting in that event thinking, this is mind blowing. It's like the first time anyone had really explained discipleship to me. Like, this is mind blowing. This is amazing. This will never work, which is funny because I'm now the director of YDisciple. But I blew it off when I first started. I was like, this will never work. It was a square peg, round hole for me. So I came back from maternity leave and I was like, what do I have to lose? I already don't have those 80%. I literally don't have anything to lose. So let's just start a small group. Let's start one small group with this intention of discipleship, that mentoring in the Christian life. And so I recruited a great leader. I had a couple young men who were interested in growing in their faith, but youth group wasn't really their thing. And said, great, okay, let's work together to make this group come together. If you could ask anybody else in this, of your friends to be a part of this, who would you ask? And they came up with a list of names. And so we invited those young people into the small group, and we got them off the ground. And then shortly thereafter, a mom called me and said, I heard about Nick's small group. How do I get that going for my kid? It's like, okay, so let's talk to Nick. Who does he want as a leader? Who does he want to be in his group? And we launched another one and another one. And in 6 months' time, we launched 11 small groups. And they were a vast majority students who were not engaged in any of our ministry. And this was all post-confirmation. Our first 2 small groups that launched were seniors and boys, which is the missing demographic in youth ministry. But this was meeting a need that what we were doing before hadn't. So it was humbling for me, for sure, to let go of control, and to step out and give leadership to other people in a way that was beyond just my normal core team leadership. But the fruit was undeniable. Numbers, sorry. These kids, so when I said my youth group was engaging about 100 students a year, that sounds great. But every good youth minister is really good at fudging numbers. And that included the kids who came and left because the game was weird and we never saw again, but I counted them. My numbers for small groups had a less than 10% attrition rate, which meant if somebody started in a small group, they stayed in a small group for at least a year, but many for several. So we just saw the proof was in the pudding and in the fruit of their spiritual lives, and the way they engaged and when they went off to college. So it's just broad strokes of what happened.
I have more questions, but I want to give Linda, go ahead.
Great.
I want to thank you. I taught for a long time in the Boston public schools, and I didn't realize that I was doing what you advocated, because I taught biology and science.
Yep.
And I don't know if it was instinct, but I stood at the doorway. I nodded and said hi to every kid who came in.
Yep.
I noticed their t-shirts.
Yes.
All those kinds of things. And the kids, God bless them, they said, we like your class, but we
Yes.
don't like biology.
That says so much, though.
I have a lot to say in terms of relationship, but I taught in the inner city. And fortunately, we had some resources. When you get in small group and kids share, what if they share trauma?
So important.
And I always think of Jesus' public ministry. He healed people, he taught people, and he formed community, the kingdom. So I had resources in the public school. We had some.
Yes. Yep.
I'm not sure parishes do.
Correct.
And you said you liked studies, so I will just leave you with this study. It's a landmark study that came out in the late 90s. It's called the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences.
Yep.
And it's very frightening because our kids, and usually it's the quiet kids. It's the spectrum. They're either super quiet or super problem.
Yeah.
You know, they act out. There's the angry type and the withdrawn type. But in a parish setting, I don't know if you've had this experience. What do you do if a youngster shares something traumatic?
Absolutely. That's an incredibly important question. And more times than I'd like to admit, I've experienced that very thing. Because when they feel comfortable with you, they feel like they can be vulnerable, and they can share their wounds. I believe every state, people who work with young people, even volunteers, are mandated reporters.
Right.
So if you are a volunteer, and a young person shares that they are if they are in danger, you have to tell the authorities. What we always recommend is you go to your parish leader, whether it's a DRE or pastor, and you can document everything, write everything down, and they can call it in. If you don't have that, then you call it in. You call the police if they are in immediate danger.
Right.
If it is past trauma, where the danger is no longer clear and present, I would hope that the Archdiocese has a list of resources of solid Catholic therapists that they can connect you with, to connect these young people with. Our role, so it's something we always have to be mindful about in relational ministry, is it isn't our role to be all the things, and we need to know when our role ends. And most of us, I'm guessing, are not licensed therapists. My role ends there. And so when is it my job to hand them off, and let them get the help that they need? So I would talk to Patrick and Rosemary, and see what good resources there are, because you're right, it's not going to be the same as the resources you have in a public school, but there is help out there for these young people.
And, well, thank you. You know, you validated a lot of things for me.
Good.
You know, thank you.
Your story about you waiting for them at the door and making eye contact with them. To this day, I remember my 6th grade teacher in Sparta, Michigan, would stand there every day and shake our hands and look us in the eye and say, "Hello, Annie. How are you today?" I don't remember anything I learned in the 6th grade, but I will always remember that.
I've had a similar experience being at the shopping mall down here, and having a voice saying, "Hi, I was there," you know.
Oh, that's amazing.
You know, or Fenway Park. You can tell I'm from Boston, but
Love it.
you know. But thank you.
Yeah.
How do you? Oh, go ahead, Linda.
Oh, just one last thought. The ACE study is a difficult. I do recommend it though. It's a landmark study, and it changed an awful lot. The Springtide group, I sent them a copy of that myself.
Oh, nice.
It's out of the CDC. You can Google it and it'll come up.
What does the C stand for in ACE?
Adverse Childhood Experiences.
How
And
do
it's about 2/3 of our kids, at least at the time of this study, that were dealing with one or more adverse experiences.
Yeah.
how do you? And I've had this experience myself, actually. You're working in youth ministry at a parish. You see kind of what you're talking about, the value of small groups and relational ministry, but the councils or your volunteers or the clergy, they don't see it or they don't get it. And you're talking about, oh, you're going to take your time to go to theater or football games, and they don't think that's a good use of time. They want that large group of kids in the youth room, and you don't know how to get there other than this. How do you talk to others in your parish about the importance and value and success that can come from
Mhm.
relational ministry.
Yep. A couple things come to mind. One is there's actually a book out there. The name of the author is escaping me, but it's called How to Lead When You're Not in Charge. Phenomenal concepts, right? So what can you control? What is under your purview of control? Maybe you are a volunteer catechist and your DRE is not on board with this yet. You can still implement some of these things in your classroom, right? You can still start with highs and lows and be intentional about getting to know them. So ask yourself, what is in my purview of control? What can I do? Maybe your pastor isn't going to let you like throw out the playbook and like start something completely new. And that's probably prudent, honestly. That's a good thing. So my recommendation is always to start small. Start with 1 hour a month where you're dedicating to like going to a nearby coffee shop to connect with people, or going to like a game or whatever. Just like start with these small steps. Same thing with starting small groups. I had a bunch of students in my ministry. I didn't say, "Hey, we're throwing everything out and we're doing small groups now." We just started one small group. So what I would recommend is ask them for permission to do one thing, right? Start one small group, and make incremental changes. But if you want to get them on board with thinking about things in a different way, like the new document from the USCCB that this entire thing is named after, Listen, Teach, Send, lays out a lot of it. So it's not just their person in the office who's telling them to say it, it's bishops who are saying these things. A lot of these studies that we can point to as well are really helpful as well. But look at what's in your control, and make small incremental changes.
You talked about how you found YDisciple when you were on maternity leave. Now, that was a while ago. YDisciple wasn't what it has become.
Mhm.
How can you and YDisciple help a person or a parish that wants to get started with kind of a new way of doing youth ministry through small groups and relational ministry? How do you
Yeah.
help people do that? When you talked about start with one small group, how does
Yep.
YDisciple help a parish do that?
Yep. Yeah, it is in a very different place. When I found it, it was essentially video resources. There wasn't a lot of coaching or personnel behind it, or even a lot of training. They had 5 training videos at the time. But it was enough for me to give my small group leaders something to start with. It was like I needed training wheels and we needed something to get moving. And it was really helpful at the time. What we've adapted it to being is having a lot more training resources, and a wider range of content for young people, because needs have changed pretty dramatically over the last decade. But what we do, so my team, I'm one of many in YDisciple. So everything we do in YDisciple is oriented toward the small group leader. Yes, we're here to help youth ministers and DREs get programs off the ground, absolutely. But our toolbox is really for the person who's running the small group. And we always try to keep that person in mind when we're creating resources. Like, is this going to make sense to somebody who doesn't like to use tech? Are these questions going to make sense? It's always something that we think about. So our platform itself has training videos and content to get that single small group started. We've even set up a pricing structure so somebody can start one small group. We have a number of subscribers that are parents who just wanted to start a small group for their kid. And so we have a pricing structure that it's reasonable for a parent to do that. It's not like, here's $5,000 to be able to run this, which is what the price of YDisciple was when I first looked at it. Nobody can afford that. So we can help with our resources alone, somebody can get started with a small group, one at a time. And I've got lots of stories of people who've done that. But the other thing that we offer is coaching, one-on-one coaching for somebody from my team. Everyone who works on my team has worked in parish or school ministry, and I'm a mean boss, and I make them continue to volunteer. So they're all currently working in parish ministry. So you'd have a one-on-one coach who would work with you one meeting a month, working through different questions, different roadblocks, different issues. It's very customized to help a small group get off, help a parish get a small group ministry started. And when we're talking about that parish coaching, we're going to say the same thing I just said here. Just start one. We're going to help you get that first one started, but then we're going to help you get that second one started and that third one started. So coaching is an incredibly huge part of what we do, because we really want to put our money where our mouth is, right? With discipleship, we're talking about walking with young people. And it'd be kind of silly for us to talk about relational ministry and walking with young people and then have a digital platform. And then we're all just sitting here like, just letting you do your thing, you know? we want to walk alongside you as well. So we have a very highly relational approach to how our whole product is structured, because we all know that it doesn't matter how good our videos are, which we put a lot of energy into them being the highest quality they can be. But it doesn't matter how good they are. If the flesh and blood adults in the room don't know how to relate to teenagers, it's all going to fall flat. If the youth minister or the DRE is floundering because they have so much on their plates, it's all going to fall flat. So how can we help people build and sustain a healthy small group ministry?
Could you give me us an idea of what a small group meeting? I know you'd start with a prayer.
Yep.
But, what the agenda is, or what the sequence of
Yes.
of interaction is from beginning to end. Maybe it's always different, but it's maybe there's just kind of a rule of thumb is that you do this, and you make sure you get to that, so that the kids end up where you want them.
I love it. Great question. We have a structure that we use that you can plug any content into. So we create content, but we believe that there's so much good stuff out there right now. You could plug a lot of different things into this structure. So we're more concerned with the context of small group discipleship, of relational ministry. Once you get comfortable with it, there's a lot of good content that you can plug in. So there's 3 movements to a good small group meeting: connect, discuss, commit. Connect. It's what we're talking about. Play a game if they like it. Go outside and play it like an actual sport. Ask them high and low, how's your week? Pray, connect with the Lord, right? So it's a way to like come in and reconnect with each other and be human, and then focus in and pray. This is what we're here for. This is what we're about. Discuss. We always want the content of our faith to be shared in a way where they have a place to ask questions and can dialogue and wonder and apply it to their lives. Everett talked about the 5 needs of teenagers, and there's a need for critical thinking around faith and life. Absolutely. So taking that, whatever content it is, it should be brief. So there's space for them to discuss and ask questions and wonder and wrestle and say, I don't know if I buy that. And then finally, commit. Because the life of a disciple is Christianity lived. It's not just like, okay, we talked about the sacraments, check. So what we always end with is a time for them to do something, to commit to doing something very small, very actionable. Pray this prayer once this week. Do something for your parents without them asking and without you taking credit for it. Just very simple things that they can do. And then when you get together the next week, when you're in Connect, you ask them, how did it go? What was that like? They can share with you their stories, the fruit of it. Some of them are going to say, I didn't do it. And they need to have a place at church where they can say, I failed, and where a group of people are going to still love them and continue to encourage them to strive further. So connect, discuss, commit. And in that final commitment, again, it's everything we do is oriented toward that relationship with the Lord. So we always land the plane with prayer together. So it takes about an hour and a half.
Answered my question.
So with YDisciple, all of our resources, video, non-video, are set up in that exact structure. Whether it is a short thing, a longer thing, everything you print off from us has a leader guide that follows that structure, has the questions written for you, laid out.
I'd like to share something. Exclusively, the content that we use are faith stories that are in writing that can be read aloud. People underline what strikes them, and you talk about it. As opposed to, and I'm thinking of Pope Paul saying the modern person is more responsive to stories and testimony than to teaching.
Yep. Yes. No, I love, that's one of my favorites.
I'm curious, this is sort of a follow-up question to Bob's question on the discuss piece, because we get this question all the time. You talked about YDisciple has a bunch of resources. What people are always asking, like, what's the content? Okay, I get relational ministry, I get small groups, or I'm chewing over the idea. Like, what does the actual content look like? I don't know. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what YDisciple has to offer in terms of content, but and I know it's great content. It's probably I think probably the best for this that there is, but there's other good content out there as well. When you go to create that content, like what makes it, like what are you looking for it to do for that discuss portion, for it to be what you need it to be successful?
Yeah. So we tend to do a couple things. We love reverse engineering our content. Teenagers are not asking questions about the incarnation or divine revelation. I'm sorry, they're not. But the incarnation and divine revelation are answers to questions that they are asking. So a lot of times with our content is we start with the question that they're asking, and then figure out like, okay, how do we get the good stuff, like the stuff we all know and get excited about? How do we get that in there to answer a question that they're actually asking? Because nobody's interested in answers to questions that they're not asking. So we do a lot of our content that way. The rest of our content is built on again, that living of the Christian life. So we're not going to do everything in the catechism, right? There's plenty of great resources out there. Our content is about prayer. How do you build a habit of daily personal prayer, especially with sacred scripture? We have one on life with the Holy Spirit. We have one on discipleship. We have one that just came out on identity and Christian anthropology. Again, they're not asking questions about Christian anthropology, but they are asking questions about like, who am I? What does it even mean to be a human? And we can come in there with the truth of the faith and answer that question, but by often asking even more questions.
It strikes me because Everett talked about this last month as well in terms of small groups, in terms of the you already made the win the relationship, the connection a couple of times, but he also made this point about asking good questions. And he said something about if no one responds to your question, you've just gotten feedback that you haven't asked a good question. And so it's noteworthy to me that you're again bringing us back to that asking questions piece to generate engagement and content.
Yep. I was leading a small group. I was with a group of girls for like 7 years, and we were doing this series on the Mass, and I got my discussion questions for the day. And the first one was, what does it mean to be a bride of Christ? And I was like, oh Lord, like we're not even starting with like, how are you? I don't even know if I can answer that question well. It jumped in way too deep, way too fast. And I don't know adults who can answer that question honestly. You can ask questions around that, right? Like, okay, in scripture, it says that we are the bride of Christ. What might that mean? And then let them say all the different things, including some wrong things, and then pull out the best of it, right? But when we look at questions, you think, could I answer that? Could I honestly answer that question? And the answer probably no, which is why it's helpful to prepare for when you're going to have a discussion, because we can look at a list of questions and be like, I know my kids, if you're doing relational ministry, I know my students, that's not going to land. We move on. We ask it differently. We adapt it.
Can I offer a suggestion for Bride of
Please.
Christ?
Yes. Fun.
I have a marriage talk that I do for kids. I do a mock wedding. Ever do a mock wedding with a group of kids? It's a lot of fun.
Super
if you can find kids to volunteer. But I have them exchange the vows, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health. And God is there for me that way. And to the best of my human ability, I'm there for God.
Yes.
That would be my answer.
But what you did is you gave them an experience. You didn't
Yes.
just come out the door asking them about Bride of Christ. You like gave them something real to wrestle with and think about. You did that.
Well, there's a repertoire of stories too, because and then I share a story of my cousin who had a stroke, and her husband, with all the disability his wife now had, he was with her, for richer or poorer, better or worse,
Yeah.
Yeah. And it led into a little bit of sacramentality and that sort of thing. But I know what you mean about the worst
Yeah.
theological question I ever got was my little niece coming home from Mass, 4 years old, and asked me why God made poison ivy.
I don't have a good answer for that either. I live in the land of mosquitoes. Like, I do not know what he was thinking.
But anyway,
Great. I
you can
love it,
make a
Linda.
fun thing out of it. But she also told me God made his rainbows out of Crayolas. She was a young theologian.
I love her. That's so good. That's so good. I love it. Wonderful.
Well, we are coming to the end of our time together. If you're looking to get in touch with Annie to learn more, there are links to YDisciple and Net Ministries in the chat, and you can ask anyone on our team. As I mentioned before and put in the chat, we have some other events coming up, and we just previewed some more of the things we'll have be offering in the winter and spring in our email today. That is also in the chat. Next month, Katie Gray from Life Teen will be talking about generational differences. In February, she'll be talking about large group gatherings of young people, because we've spent a lot of time, and we think it is most important that personal discipleship, one-on-one relationships, small group relationships, but we do also gather young people in large groups from time to time. So she'll be talking about that in February, about how to do that well. And then we'll move on from there to talking about hot button issues in March, and service in April, and health of the minister to young people with Jim Beckman in May, and going on from there. We are here to continue to support you in your efforts to grow or enhance or continue or foster good youth ministry. And as you may or may not have noticed, we're doing a major youth ministry push focused entirely on resources for adults, because we cannot be in relationship with all the young people at the Archdiocese of Boston. Like YDisciple focuses on those small group leaders, our focus is on equipping adults of the Archdiocese of Boston to be faithful witnesses, faithful catechists, faithful ministers for our Lord, for whomever they serve all across the Archdiocese. And so thank you for that, for what you do. Thank you, Annie, for what you do, and being here. My one question that it isn't exactly topical that I want to ask you sometime is how you went from, I don't know, Googling YDisciple on maternity leave to directing YDisciple. But I will have to ask you that one another time.
When I'm in Boston over a beer, we'll totally do
There
that.
we go. Any final thoughts or anything from anybody before we close for the evening?
Annie probably knows, maybe you told her, that the Archdiocese of Boston is going through the traumatic change of having no built-in sacramental program for high school people. So we don't have a sacrament to make an excuse to get the kids involved. So something like you're saying, we're coming to a conclusion because of our experience with peer ministry that to say, would you like to come to a meeting? Would you like to come to a group? Is not a very strong opening pitch. But what seems to be very strong with our kids is you are needed. You've
Yep.
got something. We'd like to activate you. And then you work back from that and say, but you can't give what you don't got. How's your prayer life? And do you have it flowing through you or not? And then you work your small group on that doorway, and then that
Yep.
doorway, which is both into developing a prayer life and also being an effective person of love.
Yep.
That's
I love
kind of
it.
where we're thinking to go next year when we just got our wits.
That's so good. I love it. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Linda, may I ask you to offer a closing prayer for us?
Oh, put me on the spot.
Sorry.
Yes. Lord, you've told us that wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in your name, that you would be in our midst. Thank you for being with us tonight. Send your Holy Spirit to guide us as we serve the youth of the Archdiocese of Boston. I'd like to express my gratitude for the speaker tonight and for all those who work on behalf of young people. Bless us all in our daily lives. Grant us your grace. Amen.
Thank you all. Have a good evening. Stay dry. It's probably going to be icy in the morning. The temperature is going to drop. So be careful out there. And I hope you all have a blessed Advent and a Merry Christmas if I don't see you between now and then. But I look forward to seeing you here and elsewhere along the way this Christmas season and in the new year.